Good morning, everyone, and thank you for your patience. There's a tradition at the University of Toronto that things start 10 minutes after they're scheduled, so we're keeping the tradition. My name is Stephen Toop, and I have the honor to serve as the director of the Munk School of Global Affairs, and it's my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the Faculty of Law at the University of Toronto and the Munk School of Global Affairs to this day-long session after the Paris attacks, responses in Canada, Europe, and around the globe. As you can tell, the purpose of today is really to reflect broadly on the effects and potential effects of the attacks in Paris. We're going to be looking at the situation in Europe, the global context. We're also looking at questions of religion, culture, and society, and then focusing, of course, on the Canadian dynamic. I should note that today also marks the commencement of parliamentary hearings in relation to Bill C-51, so we're already seeing effects, I would suggest, of the Paris attacks. Today we're going to be, I hope, enlightened and challenged by a series of conversations. These will not be formal academic presentations. Rather, there will be panels that are discussing from their particular vantage points the areas of interest today. But first, I'm very honored to welcome the Consul General of France, Jean-François Casabonne-Mazenave, who will offer words of greeting on behalf of the Government of France, obviously very appropriate given the subject today. Monsieur le Consul Général, merci.
Bonjour, good morning, everybody. Just a few words for introducing your discussions. I'm not be able to stay the whole day, but I'm happy to be with you today. I just would like to emphasize a few facts from the French point of view. That was maybe not too easy to understand from abroad. I was here in Toronto on the first day of the attack on the Wednesday, but I was in Paris then on the Thursday, and I attended the march on the Sunday as well as my colleague Marang is here, and she was in Paris too at the time. The first point maybe to understand what happened in a French point of view is the violent contrast between the violence of the assassinations and on one side, and the personality of some of the victims. Two of the cartoonists, particularly Wolanski and Cabu, were really famous in France. They were artists of the 68 generation, so they were the bad kids of the family, no for that, but grandfather too, they were 75 years old. One, Wolanski, was a cartoonist, very famous for being a former communist, for being a feminist, making cartoons on sexual freedom and things like this. And the other one, Cabu, was also in the 80s in a TV program for children. So everybody in France around the 30s has Cabu as one of his heroes as a child. So that was the kind of personality who were assassinated on this morning, and I wanted to emphasize that for describing the French point of view. The second aspect, which was very obvious, is that the victims were targeted. Journalists and cartoonists, policemen and women, and the Jewish community. And what we saw on TV, on the screens, as French citizens, was that and something different, which was that some of the victims were from European origins, some of them from Arab origins, and one of them at least was from Africa at the beginning, from French Indies. They were Jewish, targeted, but the victims were also from Catholics or Christian origins. Two of them were from Muslim origins. So in the end, some communities were targeted, but everybody felt as a victim. And that was the meaning of the march on the Sunday. Je suis Charlie, je suis juif, je suis policier. That was the meaning that when you targeted those specific persons, you were targeting all of us. And that was something which was very obvious and which maybe made those events different because there were terrorist attacks before, of course, we all know that, and not only in France. But everybody understood and felt from the first moment that it will be different and it will never be the same. Thank you very much.
Merci, Monsieur Consul Général. Now I want to mention that if any of you want to tweet out, the hashtag is hashtag after Paris. Please feel free during the course of the day to do that. Indeed, I encourage you to do that. Now, we're going to hear from Ms. Shachi Curl, who's the Senior Vice President of the Angus Reid Institute, which is a not-for-profit institute dedicated to providing public information around attitudes on important subjects. And it just so happened that the Angus Reid Institute had recently completed some very interesting polling on Canadian attitudes post the Paris attacks, and we thought it would be very useful to set a context for us to hear about those Canadian attitudes. Ms. Curl, welcome, and thank you very much for being here.
So good morning, everyone. I am mindful of the time, so I will try to keep this going very quickly. I would also say my apologies. I'm on about 3 hours sleep thanks to Air Canada, so please be kind. You're going to be hearing from a lot of experts, people who are very broadly and deeply involved and familiar with the issues outlining and defining both the Paris attacks and security issues that have come up subsequent to. But as Dr. Toop mentioned, I thought it would be a good idea to just put some broad Canadian opinion forward to set a framework for some of these discussions and really take things up to the 50,000-foot level. So, in the weeks after the Paris attacks, we did see an outpouring of public sentiment, people crowding the streets of Paris, but not just Paris, of the public square, talking about support for the magazine, support for editorial cartoonists and artists, and support for freedom of speech. We wanted to delve a little bit deeper. People were saying at the time, Je suis Charlie. Well, are we really? What we're finding is that Canadians, when we surveyed them at the beginning of February, and I would just take a moment to say and remind everyone that public opinion polling data is indeed a snapshot in time of when the question is asked, and these questions were asked about 4 weeks ago. Canadians did overwhelmingly feel that publishing the photos, or rather the cartoons and images of the Prophet Muhammad was the right thing for Charlie Hebdo to do. We asked them about where they stood in terms of weighting a notion of freedom of speech versus protecting religious sensitivities and not giving offense. And Canadians told us more than 5-1 that if they had to put things on a scale and give more importance, they felt that the importance be given to maintaining and defending freedom of speech rather than worrying about giving offense when it came to religious feelings. Now, that said, we also asked, what about the context closer to home? We saw these images published in Paris. Of course, they were widely circulated on social media and other news sites, other places. But what about the Canadian context with mainstream media here? So we asked the question, if you had the opportunity to advise editorial boards and managing editors at Canadian media outlets, what would you have said? Publish or don't publish? And remember, this is within the context of, yes, showing the images was good. Yes, we defend freedom of speech, but we're split. on whether or not Canadians and Canadian news outlets should have published the images and reprinted the images at home. So, why? Why are we finding this? Well, interestingly, we didn't ask why. We rarely ask why. We simply ask the what and the how and the when. But in this case, what you might find, and I'm going to take you through this next, with some of the results of survey data that we collected shortly after the introduction of Bill C-51, the federal government's proposed anti-terror legislation, you may find that it does shed some light on the why. So, we asked again about feelings towards C-51. And again, broadly, what we found is that the vast majority of Canadians, a high number, 4 in 5, said that they supported the proposed anti-terror legislation generally. And again, this number, when you deconstruct parts of the legislation into individual elements, in certain cases you're seeing support rise even higher, making it illegal to promote terrorism, regardless of what Canadians felt about the details of, well, what is promoting terrorism and isn't promoting terrorism, promoting violence, isn't that illegal anyway? Taking all of that aside, Canadians vastly support that, and even including things like a curtailing of freedoms and access to the legal process, extending to 7 days instead of 3, the amount of time that a suspect can be held without charges. I mean, that I would remind you is 80% in terms of the scale, so again, quite high. Even more striking to me was that fully 1/3 of Canadians felt that C-51 didn't go far enough. Perhaps that's someone who also agrees that C-51 doesn't go far enough. And when you look at that compared to those who say that it goes too far, that's 2 to 1. Twice as many Canadians say the legislation doesn't go far enough as those who say it goes too far. When you consider that within the context of other pieces of anti-terror legislation, think about C-44, which was introduced last fall. Far fewer Canadians thought that it didn't go far enough. Far more Canadians thought that it was going too far in terms of its reach. And this was a piece of legislation that contained a sunset clause, something that C-51 does not. So in spite of all of this, Canadians are not giving a complete blank check to the federal government when it comes to C-51. They still want to see greater and increased and additional oversight to the law enforcement agencies and to government itself in terms of the expanded powers proposed in the anti-terror legislation. Almost as many who say that they support the bill also want to see additional oversight. So that is something. However, we also see a great deal of trust in the Canadian government in terms of how it intends to use the personal information that is collected. Remember, you're talking about people's emails, people's text messages, access to put Canadians on no-fly lists more easily than they have been able to, a greater level of surveillance. In spite of all of that, we still see that 2/3 of Canadians either have some or a great amount of trust in the Canadian government to use that information only for the purposes that they say they're going to use it for, i.e. keeping Canadians safe and anti-terror purposes. Put that in context of where we were at the height of the Edward Snowden scandal and issues around surveillance, government watching us, a sense of our own personal information and freedom and data being safeguarded. At the time, about a year and a half ago, we asked the question, a very similar question of Canadians: do you trust government to use the information that they are taking through surveillance only for the purposes they are saying they're going to use it for? At that time, about a fifth, 20% of Canadians said, yes, I trust government to do what they're saying they're going to do with this information and do nothing more with it. Today, again, that number is closer to 63%, a threefold increase. So what do we take from this? Well, to me, it shows that we can't put too high a premium at this time and place on our sense of security, on our sense of safety, and are prepared again, at least at this time, in the wake of Paris, #AfterParis, to really be in a safer place as opposed to a more critical or inquisitive place when it comes to trusting our governments and trusting our leaders on issues of personal safety, on issues of freedom, and on issues of really going to bed feeling as though Canadians are safe and snug and their children are okay. So these are the things that we're seeing emerge now. Public opinion does change over time. We have seen numbers like this and results like this in the wake of previous attacks. It tends to ebb and flow, but we are in, at this period, perhaps a more hardened and less critical place on issues of public safety and personal freedom. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like our first panel to join us now, and I want to be clear that the panelists will be having a conversation, as I suggested earlier. The first panel, which is on Europe, immediate responses and potential effects, will be chaired by Professor Randall Hansen. We're not going to have long introductions. All of you have a program which shows the affiliations of our speakers, and I would turn the panel over to Professor Hansen, and obviously, since we're starting a little late, we will give you your full 55 minutes. Thank you very much. #AfterParis. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. I'm in the difficult position of both chairing and participating, which is to say I have to police myself. Any liberal democratic theorist would tell you that that's an extremely bad idea, but I will do my best. I'll begin, though, with questions to each of us, begin with, on my far right, to Professor Reitz. Professor Reitz, based on the social research that has been done on Muslim immigration, what can we say about the implications of the Paris attacks and the responses to them, specifically for Muslim communities within France and other Western countries, including this one?
Well, thank you, Randall. That has been my concern about this situation. It has to do with the consequences for the attitudes and the status of minority communities in France, in Canada, all the Western countries where there are minority communities. The concern is not only that Muslim minorities may feel kinship with our enemies, which some people do, but also that they may share a culture that's difficult to reconcile with Western culture. With regard to values of democracy, religious neutrality, and gender equity. So I think the status of Muslim minorities becomes problematic. In some ways, our political leaders can influence the extent of that by the way they describe the perpetrators. But when the perpetrators, in a way, when they say that they have a global Islamic agenda, to some extent it's very difficult to avoid the implication that that Muslims in general are a problem. Some leaders refer to Islamists or Islamic extremists, or in the case even of Obama, described them as Muslims who pervert Islam. But which obviously doesn't include all Muslims, but it also doesn't clarify which Muslims are included. Now, anytime Canada or any other country has been at war, domestic populations seen as being connected with our enemies come under some suspicion. Iconic example being the Japanese during the Second World War, but other groups, it happened to the Germans in the Second World War, who in a way in Canada and other countries went into hiding, to Russians during the Cold War and so on. Now, obviously, we're not incarcerating Muslims today, but we do have policy agendas that problematize Muslim communities, tightening up immigration rules in Europe, banning headscarves. There's a new proposals now in France for extending headscarf bans, which looks like politically motivated. New citizenship rules in Canada, and of course the security issues included in the terrorism bill. Support for these measures, I believe, is enhanced by concerns about Muslims in particular. So what I want to point out here now is that, of course, the social science research on Muslim immigrant communities in Canada and elsewhere clearly emphatically refutes these concerns. Most of what people believe about Muslim minorities is based on events in Muslim-majority countries, and what is based on Muslims in Canada concerns report on individual cases, media magnified, but not reflecting the group as a whole. When we look at the broad Muslim population of Canada, what we find is Muslim experience in the community, in the workplace, and so on is different from the mainstream population, but to be sure, but not that different from what is found in other religious minorities, such as Hindus and Sikhs, who receive almost no political attention on that account. The main problems of life are job opportunities, recognition of qualifications for immigrants, discrimination. There are problems of visible minority immigrants generally. They don't involve religion for the most part. And Muslims themselves report this when they that their problems do not stem from their religious affiliation. If you look at Muslims who are have the strongest religious commitments, they are not different from those with weaker religious commitments in terms of things like identification with Canada, social integration in the community, friendships, and so on. Things that we take of as indicators of integration in society. It's the same as for other religious minorities, in fact, and even with Christian immigrants, the patterns are pretty much the same. It's also the same in Quebec as in the rest of Canada, despite what one might think based on the heightened tensions over Muslims in the majority population in Quebec. Take gender equity. Gender equality is seen as one of those areas where Muslims will have difficulty integrating, and Canadians say that Muslims don't want to integrate. We find that if we measure the commitment to gender equity by women's participation in the labor market, we find that for recently arrived immigrants, Muslim women have much lower labor force participation. But so too do the immigrants of Hindu affiliation and Sikh. And the differences have to do with national origin, not religion. And furthermore, over time, the Muslim women converge to the mainstream Canadian pattern. So, in effect, assimilation is alive and well among Muslim minorities, despite the popular impression.
Jeff, I'm going to jump in there and ask you two questions, and then you can continue. Actually, three questions. One, you made the point that in times of war, absolutely true historically, populations will tend to round on minorities. How would you reconcile that point with the rest of your research, which shows that actually attitudes towards Muslims in North America are generally quite positive? Question one. Question two, you mentioned Hindu, Sikhs, and Muslims. If it's not, so point taken as read, but if you're finding a consistent pattern among some groups of more negative attitudes to gender equality or low female participation, do we need to flip the lens to say this isn't a Muslim problem? Absolutely. But there's nonetheless a different sort of problem. And thirdly, we're not simply talking about Canada. Would you make the same claims about Muslim groups in Britain, France, and Germany as you would to Canada? Or is this specifically, as ever, a story about how particularly wonderful Canada is?
Well, I've been, on the question, there's no question that the status of the Muslim communities is far more salient in public life today than it was 15 years ago. But I think what the evidence shows is that although, and Muslims are aware of this, but it does seem to have, in terms of those general attitudes, not that much effect on their integration in the community. I think that's because most Muslims, when these events happen, they have friends, they discuss these things with their friends, they're people that they know, and there will be people who have negative experiences, which is a problem, but there are also people who have very positive experiences as a result of that. And in fact, people who are resistant the negative backlash in some ways, as a result of that resistance, are integrating into the society. Now, I haven't studied Muslim minorities in every country, but I have looked in considerable detail at the French situation. And it's quite surprising that the survey data that we have on Muslim minorities in France show similar patterns of integration compared to what we observe in Quebec and in the rest of Canada. It's sort of surprising that the situation in Quebec looks more positive from that point of view than the situation in either France or English Canada. But I do want to make one point about policy responses, which I think do have an important impact. And that's policy responses which actually place constraints on large numbers of people. And one example, I think, is a very important example, are the bans on headscarves for women, which was proposed in Canada and fortunately not implemented, but we do see it in France. It has its justification in terms of French political traditions, but the problem with it is that it does force women to choose between their feelings about their religious obligations and their identity on the one hand, between that and participation in the society on the other. And the data show that in the French case, the participation of Muslim women born in France in the labor market is substantially less than what we observe in Canada. So I think that the evidence, and we've interviewed a lot of Muslim women about this, I think the evidence is that the headscarf ban is a barrier to integration into society and is not promoting it. In other words, assimilationist policies like that backfire and have very counterproductive in terms of...
Were there higher employment rates among Muslim women before 2003 in France?
I doubt it. But I am looking at data from a large national survey in 2009. And, the policies regarding this in France have been in place for some time.
A decade.
So what we're seeing now, though, is Nicolas Sarkozy coming forward with a proposal to extend the ban not only to the case of the mothers who want to participate in school activities, but to university women. Now, this seems to me to be a recipe for intense political conflict, but and must be motivated by a political agenda that he has. Maybe he won't follow through with it, but it is that kind of response I think is very worrying, and is coming in the context of after the Paris attacks.
Great. Let me thank you very much, Professor Wright. So I'll move on to Professor Fidel and ask the second question, which is this: why, in your view, are we convening this conference in the wake of the Charlie Hebdo massacre to consider its impact on the future of Europe, when we did not see a similar level of concern for the consequences of the 2011 massacre in Norway, when a right-wing extremist killed 77 people, mostly young people, in defense of national purity and against multiculturalism?
Yeah, thank you, Randall. That's really the question that I think is the most significant question. Why is it that Muslim political violence is marked with such cultural and political salience, while right-wing violence is quickly forgotten, even if the magnitude exceeds that of Muslim political violence by several orders? I think it tells us a lot about the place of Muslims in the political cultural imagination of Western culture, which is then channeled into a security response. The security response results in a tightening of political space for Muslims and religious space for Muslims. This results, again, if we go back to 9/11, which I think is a sort of paradigmatic for subsequent Western responses, it's always the, us versus them kind of model, which was much derided when President Bush said it, but seems to be the reaction that every country adopts. Right? And when that happens, I would argue that we generate legal regimes that are particular to Muslims. Right? They may not be de jure particular to Muslims, but in fact they are. So in the United States, the constitutional regime does not allow targeting a particular group for regulation. But nevertheless, we see the strategy in the U.S. is to pass very broad legislation that could potentially cover lots and lots of groups, but then through prosecutorial discretion, use it exclusively against Muslims or Arabs, right? In Europe, I think it's some ways worse because the European Court of Human Rights has effectively said that Islam is special and distinct and a unique threat to democracy. And so therefore it's given states through the doctrine of margin of appreciation a right to regulate Islam in a way that is not recognized for other religions. So national majorities essentially have the green light to do all sorts of things in the regulation of Muslim life that they couldn't do for other religious communities. And so I think it's significant that if we look at the actions of Andres Breivik and compare them to what happened in Charlie Hebdo, that there are a lot of parallels. Both of these incidents emerged from individuals who were deeply alienated from their own societies. They got connected to transnational networks through modern means of communication, the dark side of globalization, as people call it. They imagined themselves to be involved in some sort of cosmic struggle, that they're acting on the vanguard for their respective communities, hoping to achieve something glorious, right? But I think the reactions in Norway and France are radically different, right? And so maybe ironically, the very fact that Norway treated it with such aplomb and calmness, right, has contributed to the fact that we all forgot it. In fact, commentators are coming on TV talking about Charlie Hebdo as the worst massacre in modern European history, and this happened just 3 years prior to it, right? So this is the problem. I think that Muslims in the West, the problem they face right now as a result of security policies is that they have practically two choices. Either they become Ayaan Hirsi Ali or they become Anwar Awlaki, because they're basically placed in the position of a practical inquisition. Any kind of manifestation of religious practice immediately makes them suspect as potential terrorists. And so this creates this kind of bifurcation, that if they want to be sort of faithful Muslims, right, there's this tendency, there's a fear, right, that internal dynamics leads you to make that more and more obvious by becoming more and more alienated from mainstream society. On the other hand, right, to the extent that you wish to integrate, right, the political dynamics are such that you have to renounce more and more expressly and vehemently your own religious background, right? And so the problem of having what I would call a critical middle, where you can act as a citizen, right, practice your religion to the level that you wish to, express critical political views without becoming the target of security services, right? Unless that can be established, right, I don't see any kind of solution from this. And then, of course, the irony, right, is that the security solution has its own internal dynamic. To the extent that the problem is always framed as one of theology, it can never be solved, because a theological inquiry is always going to be internal to the one accused. The accused can never convince the accuser of his sincerity. So at the end of the day, you have to wipe out the object of your suspicion, right? I mean, the Inquisition in some respects can be considered to be quite successful. It got rid of the target communities. Not very successful from the perspective of the targets, but from the perspective of the majority, that's the only stable outcome that's left. Once you start down this path of theological inquisition, that's the logical end. So the answer is to stop it, but I don't see how we can, unfortunately. The political dynamics are such that we are unwilling as a society to engage in any of the political claims that are motivating Muslim extremism. Instead, we want to write it off as theology, and let's force them to change their theology, and that will solve the problems, which I think is just completely fantastical thinking.
Yeah, let me come back on that. Extremely interesting comments. Two thoughts, though. One is those figures between the extremes. I mean, the most popular and successful Muslim intellectual in Europe is, of course, Tariq Ramadan, who's certainly between those extremes. And even a group which is really, for my liking, and I suspect for yours, quite conservative, the Muslim Council of Britain, has a space, a very recognized and indeed, until recently, funded space in public discourse in Europe. So that'd be comment one. Isn't there much more diversity of debate in Europe than you're suggesting? And the second one is, unfair though it perhaps is, isn't this just a question of numbers, in that the Norway attacks, afterwards there was speculation on a right-wing plot across Europe, there were 6 arrests, and they found out, in fact, he had simply acted alone. Whereas in the case of jihadist attacks, or these extremist attacks, if we simply want to use neutral language, there have really been dozens of them. And I tested this hypothesis by looking up terrorism in 1970s Britain. And I found a case in 1980 where Iranian Arabs conducted a siege of the Iranian embassy in London. They threw someone out the window and killed him. 3 people were killed in the siege. No one in 1970s Britain or 1980s Britain talked about Muslim or Arab terrorism. A little bit in the 1970s with the Palestinians, but terrorism was, of course, Irish. And that was simply a function of numbers. And then when the violence ended, the discourse shifted. So if you could just respond to those, and then we'll move on to something else.
It's a very complicated question. We require a very complicated answer. But the rise of transnational Islamist networks, of course, is directly related to the weakening of Arab states in particular. Right? The ineffectiveness of Arab states has produced, in large part, the creation of informal transnational networks of resistance, right? So that is a byproduct of, in fact, intentional foreign policies of the United States in particular to weaken the capacity of Arab states to resist a particular U.S. agenda abroad. That's one thing. The second thing, which I'm really more interested in, is the first point. What about people like Tariq Ramadan? Unfortunately, Tariq Ramadan is vilified in a place like France, right? And in recent legislation proposed in Britain, at least from my understanding, I wouldn't want to, swear to it. The Conservative government is preparing a whole host of legislation that's going to target these kinds of groups that you were mentioning. They call them non-violent preachers of hate or something like that. I'm not really sure.
The Muslim Council in Britain,
yeah.
But
and then finally I would say that there is lots of room for right-wing racist political parties in Europe, right? Why? Let's suppose that everything that's said about, backward Muslims is true in Europe. Why cannot they be tolerated in the same way that right-wing racists in Europe are tolerated? Bring them into the tent instead of having them outside, right? I mean, in theory, that's supposedly one of the advantages of democracy, is by giving everybody a stake in it, there's less likely to produce violence. Now, the challenge is to reduce the number of people who think violence is okay. And I don't see how policies that have been adopted consistently since 9/11, which reduce the space for political, cultural, and religious expression, that free expression without fear of monitoring, being thrown in jail for some, bizarre theory of causation of terrorism, helps that. It just generates, certainly some people, maybe most people are cowards, and so they'll just shut up. But for the really committed, that sort of pushes them over the edge. And that's what we don't want, I think.
No, I agree. I guess I would, in response to that, I would say, again, I think there is more diversity of debate. I take your point that there might be a bit of a double standard, but when Pegida, I've forgotten the acronym, but the Patriotic Europeans Against the Islamicization of Europe organized in Dresden, Angela Merkel came out and said, these people are filled with hate in their hearts, have nothing to do with them. Gerhard Schroeder called for an uprising of the decent, and very quickly the the anti-Islamophobes were outnumbering the Islamophobes. But let's move on to something else, and then we can open the discussion a bit more. This is my question to myself, which I think is a particularly excellent question, so I'm going to ask it. So my question was, isn't it the case that the right to mock religion is so firmly within the bounds of acceptable free speech that this should not be the issue here. And my answer to that is absolutely yes. Making fun of religion, any religion, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Druids, whatever, is perfectly acceptable. This is not what the debate should be about. Begs the question, what should the debate be about? Not culture, but cash. The problem in Europe, and Jeff alluded to that, though you gave it more of a religious grounding than I would, is not a problem of culture or religion or Islam. And the suggestion that Islam is not a European religion betrays, in my mind, a staggering ignorance of Habsburg and Southeast European history. It's absolutely absurd. The problem is unemployment. The problem is that you have, among Muslim communities in Europe and others, unemployment rates that are something like 2 to 5 times the average, consistent patterns of underachievement in schools, low earnings, economic exclusion. You cannot be integrated in a liberal market society if you don't work, and the better job you have, the more integrated you are. So the conversation should be about how to address that, which is a complicated matter. It's about skills, it's about training, it is about exclusion in Islamophobia, though not only about exclusion and Islamophobia. Jeff, do you want to come in on any of that?
Yeah, well, I wanted to comment on the what Mohammed had said, and it partly relates to what you're saying also, which is that he pointed out that there is, in the reaction to the Paris attack, additional focus on Muslims as a problematic community within our society. And in particular, he mentioned displays of religious affiliation in whatever way it happens is something that people may come to feel is dangerous. That's what he said. And I completely understand why he feels that way. I think those are the attitudes that are out there. However, I think that most members of the Muslim community, at least in Canada, I think also in France, don't find that their religious activities are constrained, and they don't describe their problems primarily in terms of that issue, with the exception of the headscarf issue, which I think does concern people because of the fact that going out on the street with a headscarf creates problems for people, and so that's an everyday kind of activity.
In Canada. In Canada.
In France.
France, we're talking about.
In Canada, it's much more common to see that, and women working in all kinds of contexts and wearing a headscarf, and no one's saying that the religious that somehow this is religion permeating the public sphere or something like that. That's just people wearing a piece of cloth on their head, and that's fine. So, but it does seem to me that it has much more of a social impact in France. But generally, I don't think that religion. We were told by many people in France that the French, by Muslim people, that the French are obsessed with religion. And, why is this? They feel that way, but that's not their experience in daily life, that practicing as a Muslim is really so I don't think we should think of there's some kind of religious war going on in societies where highly religious Muslims are rising up to confront the state that wants to repress them. I think it's a lot of the debate that's going on is really completely irrelevant to the everyday lives of Muslim people. And a lot of this debate has diverted attention from issues of racial discrimination, employment, and those kinds of things, which are barriers to the integration of Muslim and other communities in our society.
And when you look, I'll let you right now, Mohammed, but when you look at the country in Europe that has the best attitudes towards Muslims and the country whose Muslims have the best attitudes towards their co-nationals, it is France, by some margin, including very strong support among French Muslims for secularism. Mohammed, I think you wanted to say something.
Yeah. First of all, I think that you can't, I would say it's a truism that if you have better economic integration, you're going to have less social conflict. The problem is that what's the causal relationship, right? I would say, at least based on what we have seen in the United States, that racism is both a cause and effect of segregation and underachievement. The two go hand in hand. Sure. So in the United States, the solution was to attack the racism, attack the segregation, right? Because that would create the opportunities for those who had been excluded to then, make themselves better integrated into the market, as you were saying. So until, let's just say anti-Muslim sentiment is addressed, tackled on, recognized as a real problem and dealt with, I don't think we can think of we will be able to solve the cash problem independently of that. I'm not a social scientist. All I have is anecdotal evidence. But I can say that I've met several Arab immigrants from France to North America, highly trained people who want nothing to do with France. Matter of fact, I can say that I've never met a French Muslim who's had a positive experience of France. With all due respect to the French Council, and there's a problem in France. There really is a problem in France. I'm not sure how to take seriously the survey evidence. Nobody's going to say he's a bigot. Nobody's going to say he's a bigot.
The Germans come pretty close. Right. If you compare those attitudes in Germany, the attitudes in Germany towards Muslims are extremely negative. So we're getting variance within the data.
But France has its own, well-deserved reputations for commitments to egalitarianism, et cetera, right? I don't want to exaggerate the problems in France either, right? France is a liberal democracy, one that we recognize as a great liberal democracy. It can just be doing a lot better on this score. A lot better. And we shouldn't kid ourselves to think that it's an imaginary problem. It's a real problem. And even I hate to say it, even in Toronto, even in Yorkville, I personally know of Muslim women who wear headscarves who get verbally assaulted for their headscarves. Don't pretend that it's not here, right? I'm not saying that there's going to be some sort of pogrom against Muslims or anything like that, right? But don't think that it doesn't exist here. It really does. And for Muslim women who do wear the headscarf, it makes them a target for existing groups of bigots.
Yeah, well,
Jeff
I
wanted to say
certainly
something.
agree with that. That's definitely happening, and it happens in France. It happens in every country. But the question is, across the Muslim community generally, what is the experience of day-to-day life? And I think that it is important for people to know that most Muslims are not actively engaged in this conflict as a part of a day-to-day life. They're really going about their lives like the rest of people in society, and they're actually successfully integrating. And if we don't put barriers to their integration in their in front of them, that that there's nothing to fear from this population. I guess in a way I disagree with what you say about France, that there's no Muslims who are happy in France. I think that the data that I've seen and the experience I have there suggests very clearly that the day-to-day life of Muslims in France, they don't think of themselves, primarily as Muslims. For up until 9/11, they thought of themselves as Arabs primarily, and that was the big debate in France. Now it's a debate about Islam, but the everyday experience is very similar to the everyday experience of Muslims in Canada.
Yeah.
In terms of who they have as a friend, whether they think of themselves as French, and many of them do think of themselves as French, certainly as many think of themselves as French as Muslims in Canada think of themselves as Canadians. So despite the fact that the mainstream population is obsessed with religion, the everyday lives of members of the community are not as much affected by that as we might think.
Okay, but I want to clarify. I didn't say that there are no happy French Arabs. I said that the ones that I have encountered have not expressed that sentiment. And these are highly educated professionals who feel deeply discriminated against. And I would not take comfort in saying, oh, they feel French. This is a double-edged sword. Because if you expect a certain level of treatment and you don't get it, that causes a lot of resentment and alienation. And there is, to be honest, a side of liberalism that is violent. Right? If you do not get your rights, right, in liberalism, there is this revolutionary component to it. Right? So we shouldn't take this in mind. We're not talking about traditional people who are raised in societies where you're expected to defer to authority. When you grow up in a liberal environment where your default is expectations of equality and then you do not get it and you experience racism and exclusion, right? Then there's what I would say is a toxic mix of ideology of religious justifications for violence, liberal justifications for violence, and lo and behold, some people then become violent. Not very surprising.
No, I certainly don't want to appear to be an apologist for discrimination. All I'm saying is that when you do a survey across Muslim populations in France and ask people if they have experienced discrimination based on religion, culture, language, and so on, you have about the proportion of people who say they have is exactly the same as the proportion of Canadian Muslims who express that. And not only that, most of them are talking about discrimination based on culture and being Arab background. And the same thing in Canada. They'll say it's based on race. They will not say that it's based on
skin
religion.
color. You mean basically skin color?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, skin color. Exactly.
Yeah, it's interesting.
So it's very similar in Canada. You'll find people who will say that they have experienced discrimination.
Two comments in reaction to that. One is fascinating discussion. Of course, we are talking about quite different populations in that Muslim communities above all the United States, but also Canada, are highly educated populations, whereas Muslim communities, because of different selection systems and the migration system in Europe, are not, which ties back to the point I made about education and skill. We touched on the issues of violence and radicalization. I think one should always talk about the elephant in the room, so why don't we say something about that? You mentioned discrimination and frustration, a sense of alienation, Mohammed, and that certainly seems to be in the ring, but I've always found that difficult as a causal explanation for two reasons. One is the undeniable fact is that we're talking about a tiny minority of Muslims in Europe, as everywhere else, who are tempted by violence. And the overall population of poor and thus potentially alienated Muslims is much, much higher than that. So if there were any kind of causal link between alienation and violence, you would expect more, not less, whereas we can all agree that there's very little. And also, when you compare across the countries, the country with the most radicalized and potentially violent Muslim population in Europe is not France, is not Germany, it is Britain. So in a sense, the country which has been most multicultural, where the hijab has a most prominent place in public discourse, watch Channel 4 News, or the BBC, and we're all Anglophiles. We think of the Brits as basically nice, open, lovely people. This is the country with the most radical population. And it seems to me then it's much more about source country issues coming from Pakistan rather than North Africa or Turkey, where there's much more integration with Europe. Anyway, could you both speak to that? Mohammed, do you want to go first?
Well, I was going to say, Randall, I totally agree with you. I would never, again, disclaimer is I'm not a social scientist, so I don't try to develop a kind of causal model for anything. I would think of more of this like the relationship of cigarette smoking to a broad variety of public health issues, right? You reduce smoking, you get, generally speaking, better long-term collective outcomes, even though there might not be monocausal relationships between smoking and all these different conditions. But your point is well taken. There are obviously lots and lots of factors that turn one person into somebody who walks down the path of violence. I'm speaking about my own personal experience in what I've seen directly sometimes as an expert witness in terrorism cases, seen what motivates defendants, what they say about themselves. And political ideology is very important for them. The feelings of alienation, not just from an Islamic perspective, but also having grown up here and having assimilated some sort of ideals of what revolutionary justice entails, et cetera, et cetera. This is also an important factor in the psychology of Western Muslims who grew up here and why they're very different than their parents. Because to a certain extent, they've assimilated some of these ideals about egalitarianism and revolutionary and the justification of revolutionary violence. And so I think it's very dangerous to be pursuing this path of extraordinary regulation of Muslim communities, because that is going to alienate certain groups. And oftentimes, I think your paper pointed out, it's the more educated and the more affluent who tend to be the more drawn to revolutionary ideology. And I think that's generally been observed across the world. It's not the most poor and marginalized. It's those who are, socially aspiring, who are willing to take up arms to change the world. And I think you see that in Muslim minorities in Europe, right? People sometimes are surprised. Why is it the children that are more radical than the parents? Well, like I said, parents had no expectations of anything, right? They're just happy to have escaped where they're coming from. The children want a lot more.
Yeah, I don't have a comment about the criminological side of things, what it is that motivates people to take up arms within their own society. But I did want to respond to the point about Britain and anti-immigrant attitudes there. We often talk as though the anti-immigrant attitudes in countries like UK or also France has to do with the reasons that are put forward in public debate, such as that the immigrants represent a threat to the secular society or are challenging multicultural. The data actually suggests that most of the variation across countries in attitudes toward immigration has to do with the perception of immigrants as an economic asset or not. In Canada, we think of immigrants as an asset. In France, they don't. And to some extent, that reflects the difference in the immigrants that we have. We're selecting immigrants here on the basis, or at least the public certainly believes that the immigrants are being selected here and in Quebec on the basis of their economic contribution. And in the United States, people like immigration as much in a way as they do in Canada, but they don't like people coming into the country to pursue their own agenda rather than the agenda of the broader society. In France, a lot of immigrants do not come to France with an invitation from the government. So there's a much more pervasive feeling that immigration is something that happens to the country and it's out of their control. So then you need to justify an anti-immigrant position. And then we bring in all kinds of cultural issues and so on. But that's not what's fundamental. And I think the same is true in Britain. The controversies over immigration in Britain rooted back in the 50s and 60s when immigration had no controls whatsoever. And that created a lot of anti-immigrant feeling that persists in the country today.
Yeah, and when people rant now about immigrants in Britain, they won't rant about Muslims, they'll rant about Poles, East European integration. Let me push you a bit further on that. Would you go a step further and say, in fact, they're right?
That they're right?
The publics and the two continents are right. I mean, if we take the premise from econometric evidence that immigration brings a benefit when it's skilled and a cost when it's unskilled, then aren't the two populations just arriving at, in fact, the social scientifically correct conclusion? Immigrants are a benefit in North America and therefore popular. They're a cost in continental Europe and therefore unpopular.
Whether immigration is a cost or a benefit is something that's debated among the economists. I don't know if there are economists who are here, but I can tell you that some economists calculate immigrants as being a plus when we pay them less than they deserve. And other economists calculate that immigrants are a plus when we pay them what they deserve. So these models are, I think, not something that we should rely on.
You're slightly dodging the question, so I'm going to put it a different way. In sense implicit what you said is really that much of the support for immigration in North America is not about greater tolerance. It's not about greater respect for Islam or any other religion. It's about the fact that immigrants are viewed here as a profound economic benefit.
Absolutely.
And they're not.
That's absolutely.
And we have no welfare state, so when they're unemployed, they don't cost us that much. And if they can't get a job as a doctor, they have to drive a cab. And this is all cheap for the taxpayer.
The reality is that they're not that often unemployed. And so
exactly, exactly.
I certainly think that that's important. We think that our multicultural attitudes are an important part of why people support immigration. And it turns out that people who like immigration like multiculturalism. But on a cross-national basis, that's not the difference that really counts in terms of whether people support immigration or not.
Great. I'm going to give Mohammed the last word.
Yeah. Again, I can't plead any theory about the contribution of immigrant populations to the productivity or the GNP of various European countries. But I just don't see why, if that were the case, we don't have a debate just limited to rational immigration measures, but instead we have bizarre legislation about how animals are slaughtered, and we're not going to allow Muslims to slaughter cows the way they want to, or allow girls to wear a headscarf into high school or now university in France, or we're not going to allow Muslim and Jewish kids to have pork-free meals in certain cities in France. Again, I'd like to try to attribute things to maybe materialist causes, and if everything were going well, then everyone would be happier, and they wouldn't be distracted by these sorts of things, right? But there are latent biases that political entrepreneurs and democracies, unfortunately, can tap into and exploit, right? And so, presumably, Jean Pen or his daughter now, they are clever politicians. They know what motivates the populace, and so they appeal to it, right? So it's not, we can't pretend that it's not there. It is there, right? And politicians really need to confront it. Instead of encouraging the spread of the hijab ban like Sarkozy should be slapping it down. But that's not what happens. Right? This is why I'm pessimistic. I don't see any hope for things getting better. I think things are going to get worse.
Okay, well, on that note, I guess rather pessimistic conclusion to a fascinating, what I regarded as a fascinating discussion. Thank you very much for your contributions.